I would like to thank everybody here for being here today and welcome you to the study of Russia. When I was working on this collection, I developed a very personal relationship with each of my works. I was inspired by Russia's multicultural heritage, by its architecture, its literature and history. Perhaps the highlight of that experience was working on Pushkin's painting. I completely fell in love with his world and his works, his creative genius and the way he expresses Russian soul. I really hope that everyone here today will be able to see the beauty that I saw in Russia when working on this collection. And now I would like to introduce to you the moderator of our panel discussion, one of the UK's leading art critics, Dixon.
Let me introduce everyone who's on the panel. And I'm not going to read it late because you've all got a copy of this. So I've got on my right, this is John Holden, who is an associate at the think tank Demos, and also the author of this Influence and Attraction. It's a very interesting recent report on the subject of our debate today. Next to him is Kadri Liik, who's Senior Policy Fellow of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And she's also worked as Moscow correspondent for several Estonian daily papers in the 90s. Next to her is William MacDougal, who I think 9 years ago founded MacDougal's Auction House, which is a specialist Russian auction house, which I believe last week during Russian Art Week came in, was scraping into the charts at number 3, having done 9 million quid's worth of business and setting 5 world records. Is that right? So it was a good week last week for the MacDougal operation. Then Gayana Umyarov, who's the curator of the Study of Russia exhibition, and also senior curator of the Art Gallery of Uzbekistan. And a little bit later, I think we're going to be having Theodora Clarke. She's not with us just yet. So, cultural diplomacy. My own experience is fairly limited. I used to be on the board of the government art collection. I experienced at first hand the way in which cultural objects can become loaded in ways that aren't always easy to predict when they enter the diplomatic situation. We bought for the Riyadh embassy, the British embassy in Riyadh, a new build embassy. We bought this beautiful pop art painting by Patrick Caulfield called Fish and Sandwich, and it was absolutely perfect. The dimensions were right, it was at the right price, Whittingdale's Art Gallery, and we sent it off to Riyadh to hang on the wall of the new British embassy there. Immediately got a very cold telephone call from the British ambassador saying, "Thank you for the painting. The style is good, fits with the architecture, and the shape is good, and the size is good, but that is a ham sandwich." So a big panic at the government art collection. A ham sandwich on the wall of the Riyadh embassy. Quick, phone up the artist. Phone up Patrick. Patrick, a little bit drunk. What kind of sandwich is it, Patrick? It's made of paint. I know that, but you know, if you had to name what kind of sandwich it would be, what kind of sandwich would it be? Well, I painted it in 1983. My studio was in Tottenham Court Road. I used to go to that Jewish deli. It would have been a salt beef sandwich. Phew, salt beef sandwich. Phone up the embassy in Riyadh. It's okay, it's a salt beef sandwich. Long pause. It still looks like a ham sandwich. Bugger. So the painting came back. Anyway, that's my one experience in cultural diplomacy. Not entirely successful. But I'm going to ask you first, John, if you had to define these new phrases that are unfamiliar to me, soft power, cultural diplomacy. I mean, give us the idiot's guide to what those phrases mean.
Okay, I'm certainly not going to try and define them, but I think you can characterise them. Culture is a notoriously difficult word to grapple with. I think Raymond Williams, the great Welsh Welsh critic, said that it's one of the 2 or 3 most difficult words in the English language, and it certainly is, because we use it to mean lots of different things at the same time. But in this field of cultural diplomacy, I think traditionally, going back a while, we would have thought of this mostly as a synonym for the arts and culture, as it were, the high arts. But now I think we have to put in that pot a whole range of other things, of popular culture, and increasingly the culture that people are making for themselves and communicating and collaborating on and monetizing through the internet. So I would say we could look at cultural diplomacy and put things in that package which we're very familiar with, such as, the Terracotta Army coming to the British Museum, or the Royal Shakespeare coming to touring New York. But we should also be thinking about Hollywood and Bollywood, and increasingly about things like a Korean band called UKIS causing riots on the streets of Lima in Peru when they visited, that we don't know anything about, but they're a kind of form of international cultural relations. And I imagine also tourists having encounters at a street level. One of my own experiences, I was in Madagascar a few years ago, out trekking days away from the nearest road, and every night around the campfire people would come with homemade instruments. And one night we sat down, and amongst the traditional tunes and traditional dance, I suddenly recognised a Jackson 5 one. And that's when I first got interested in the subject, because I realised that the whole idea of what culture means and what international relations with culture means had changed very, very significantly. So I think we should rather think about culture quite widely here. And indeed, in this publication, Influence and Attraction, we also look at things like broadcasting, sport, food, language as being of significance. Soft power that is rather more tightly defined was invented by the American Harvard academic Joseph Nye. And his idea is that in diplomatic relations, it's about attraction and co-option rather than coercion. So you contrast hard power, military and economic power, and contrast with this rather fuzzier, softer thing that comes into play. So I'll stop there. We could talk further.
Okay. Well, Kadri, can I bring you in? What do you hope for when we talk about the UK-Russian Europe culture? I mean, when we're talking about that's cultural diplomacy, as it were, in action, how would you hope that it could work?
How it could work or not? Thank you. When I was preparing to come here, I was trying to think what to say. I mean, my job is to try to understand Russian in my mind, but I also have a heart for Russia. I really am attracted by Russia. It has always puzzled me why Russia doesn't really get cultural diplomacy or gets it in a wrong way. To just tell a story, I didn't know how many of you have read Nikolai Gogol, famous Russian writer, still often quoted as captured something very essential about Russia. Gogol has a short story about a bureaucrat who becomes so important and identifies himself so much with his uniform that in the end he turns into uniform. There is an empty uniform walking on the streets. And I've seen a Russian ambassador like that. There was an ambassador in one of the countries who had approved of the August coup of 1991, for which he was underappreciated for the next 20 years, had very little jobs. And in the end, under Putin, he was sort of rehabilitated and got an ambassadorial job yet again. And he was so shy after having erred once. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He just walked around in his ambassadorial uniform. And when people would ask me, is he of any use at all? I would always say that, that he's actually very strong in cultural diplomacy. Whenever I see him, I think of Gogol. And that really was the case. It was an embodiment of Gogol's stories. But it doesn't have to be that way. I think influence and attraction really are keywords. and attraction can give you influence, but if you try to use your influence to force attraction, then it doesn't work. And Russia often tries, for some reason, to do it that way. I've heard Russian political scientists say that what Russia's strategy in approach to neighbors, what it is, forced friendship. I mean, it's oxymoron, you cannot force friendship. But if Russia only trusted this natural attractiveness, that is absolutely there, it would have all the friendship in the world, and influence, and everything. But it's strange that Russia doesn't often trust that it is naturally attractive to its neighbors, to people outside Russia's borders, far away. And it tries to somehow control the process. I wonder why. Maybe because, you know, literature and artists, and they often have been seen as subversives in Russia itself, and the powers that be have always had uneasy relationship with them. I mean, Pushkin was exiled, Bulgakov couldn't get his works printed. Even nowadays, you have writers in Moscow whose books have been burned. And so the powers try to use a culture that they appreciate to gain influence, but they would do best if they just relied on their own natural culture, real artists, let them go out, interact with other artists, and everything would actually come. So I don't think I should speak any longer. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to realize that we have a case of real art and real attraction here. So in that sense, if Russia approaches the issue of culture in such a manner, it will work fine, and I would attend all the events. If it approaches it in a different manner, then I would still attend the events, but come out to different conclusions.
A suitably diplomatic reply. I mean, I think my experience of being in Russia is that there's a huge divide between state-approved art, which is just bizarrely awful. I mean, just astonishingly awful, and huge amounts of it are there. And that's still very much present in Russia. And then, on the other hand, there are these sort of independent initiatives, artists just getting on, as you say, with being themselves, who tend to be far more interesting. People tend to be bad in the way that British artists can be bad. I mean, they're just normal artists like any other. So it seems to me like you're almost hoping that the government gets as little involved as possible, just gives money and doesn't actually try to control it. Whereas in Britain, in a way, we always want the government to get a bit more behind these sorts of initiatives, because they seem to be very linear of it. That's just my impression.
Yeah. I think when governments get too close to culture, it completely ruins the point of the exercise. People get deeply suspicious of it. Because there's a tradition of cultural diplomacy starting off as being one elite talking to another, and then being a sort of elite talking to a mass through broadcasting. Now what's happening is it's a peer-to-peer relationship as well as all those other three. Governments haven't quite got to grips with the fact that we are all talking to each other in this world, and they cannot control it regardless of what they think. So I think they have to first of all recognise that. They have to recognise that if they're too close to it, it loses its force. I think that there's a quote from someone who did a report to the BBC World Service saying that if there was a Labour office saying we broadcast in conformity with British policy, it would be nobody would listen to it, which is quite right. But they do have to be, governments do have to be enablers. They do have to set the ring and make the conditions possible for independent actors to act to their best advantage. And I think also governments will be wise to recognise the economic importance of these cultural interactions happening nowadays, which is kind of another side of the cultural diplomacy equation.
William, if I can bring you, you're sort of at the business end of, I don't know if what you do is cultural diplomacy as such, or just selling pictures, but nonetheless, by having the business that you are instrumental in making sure that a lot of Russian pictures come to London. And are the buyers of those pictures, are the people who dip their toe in the water, are they all Russian, or is this actually spreading Russian culture more broadly than it would be if say, you opened your auction house in Moscow?
Well, thank you. From a business standpoint, I'm not trying to give example. Our business is sourcing Russian art in the West and selling it to Russians in Russia. It's not actually involved that much in communicating with the West, except that the Russian art exhibitions in London are by far the best way of seeing Russian art in London. It's much better than any museum exhibitions. The art on display at 4 auction houses that had Russian art auctions last week was really quite a spectacular selection of Russian art. And as it was all sold to private hands, it was a rare opportunity to see it as well. So I would urge you every 6 months to go to the so-called Russian week of art auctions and see the exhibitions. Now, in terms of the subject, I think it's a very interesting subject because Russia, for most of its history, has had a pretty bad press in the West in terms of hard power. I think unduly negative, but nonetheless it's been negative for most of the time. Whereas it's quite often had a very good press in terms of soft power. People love the literature, the art, the music, and it's created a very good image that way. And it does make a lot of sense for Russia to try and play on that to improve its image in the West.
Does anybody, I'm working to a sort of broad agenda here, but does anyone have anything to say about the actual foreign policy objectives that might be met through acts of cultural diplomacy, or are we trying to link the two things, government and art, too closely together?
Shall I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I think there are kind of increasing levels of engagement that people want out of, the governments want in particular, out of cultural diplomacy. The first thing for lots of states, and I'm not talking here about Russia, obviously, is just to get your name in front of people, to increase familiarity, to make people know that you exist. The second level is to increase appreciation. So yes, I know that they exist, and actually they're pretty interesting, and I'd like to know a little bit more. The third level is to engage people properly, to encourage people to see you as an attractive destination for tourism, as a potential trade partner, someone who you're willing to do business with. And I think the fourth level of engagement, which is the ideal for most states, is to influence behaviour. So to take it to a level of trust where people will encourage in investment, and where you can influence, say, votes in the UN because you're a trusted partner. But, having said that, can I carry on?
Yeah, sure.
I think we're actually moving into a different phase in cultural relations in some places in the world, where increasingly the agenda is not the exercise of power or the exercise of influence for your own ends, so much as a seeking of mutual understanding, because there are so many problems in the world now which are multilateral problems, and these can only really be solved through establishing a degree of trust between people. And to a certain degree that depends on a cultural basis, a basic cultural understanding underneath it. So cultural diplomacy now is as much about the need to learn as it is to project, and it's as much about creating mutual understanding as it is about projecting what you've got to offer.
Yeah, the first time I spent time in the UK was 15 years ago when I did my master's degree at Lancaster University with the help of British Council Scholarship. I had student scholarship, and that was really generous. They paid my student fees for me, expensive overseas fees and living expenses. I got handsome stipend. It was a wonderful year. I simply had time to read and learn. And when I tried to think why are they doing it, because obviously they're trying to pick people whom they think who are in the future going to be influential in their own countries. They try to bring them over to the UK, so that they are familiar with the UK, so that they know people, and so that they form good opinions of the UK. And actually they completely succeeded with me. I was a great fan of the UK. It may have backfired a little bit now when I came back. And so when actually British politics has got so much more self-insulated and deluded meanwhile that I have different memories of it. But even so, I'm a fan of the country. So it definitely worked in some sort of indirect ways, but really I was sort of well-disposed towards the British. We had common themes to discuss, we had common approaches to certain things. I would know what to ask about things I had picked up here. So it definitely works. To achieve some very concrete objectives with the help of culture, well, these are rare occasions. I mean, these happen. I guess many powerful and authoritarian leaders have had their favorite authors, favorite composers, and you can please them by kind of offering them that. But that doesn't happen that often. The top of my head, from the sort of recent times, I can think of one example. Luckily not too decisive, because such things shouldn't be too decisive in foreign policy, actually. That would be wrong from the perspective of foreign policy. But I come from Estonia, and Estonia really wanted to join the European Union in the mid-90s. Many in the UK would ask why, but that was the case. Estonia hoped to get some hard security through that. And the way it worked was that countries had to reform a great deal and qualify. And the European Commission would send delegations to evaluate their progress and really read the thorough reports, and they went pretty deeply into the things and understood well. But they also had their human weaknesses, the people from the Commission, and sometimes these were cultural weaknesses. And that one high-ranking person we knew, that he really loved Arvo Pärt, one of the most famous Estonian composers. And Estonia being a small society, the then foreign minister, who now happens to be president, just called up his friend, who happened to be a famous composer, conductor, and asked, that day, that time, can you maybe do a small rehearsal of part of your choir? We'll just be passing through on our way to lunch. And so they did. And the guy from the commission had tears in his eyes and said, "You bastard, I see through. I know what you're doing, but you succeeded."
I sometimes wonder if cultural diplomacy, if we to use this phrase again, it's a place where people can meet when they can't agree about anything else. So they can agree that they like Arvo Pärt, or they can agree that they like Beethoven. This is one place that you can meet. And I know for a fact that I think at least 2 times in the last few years, the only person from Britain welcome in Iran has been Neil McGregor at the British Museum, because he's there for reasons we can all agree on, things that are important to all of us. So maybe there is it's almost an element of common humanity where everything else does outbarrier. Yes, I agree.
The British Museum is a really interesting example with Iran, when they had the Syrian Empire exhibition, the Vice President of Iran standing next to Jack Straw on the platform, which couldn't happen really in a diplomatic setting. And the relationship, I think, was cemented when the British Museum lent the seal of silence to the National Museum in Tehran, and it came back. It was fine.
Yeah, it's very interesting on that. Moving on, I think one of the things that is slightly dispiriting about the current government in this country is that what seems to be, I don't know if it's a dislike of culture, but there's an absolute indifference to it, or it's a terror of it. I don't think I ever hear anybody talk about it whatsoever. When it is the one thing in British life that strikes me as an unqualified success. You go anywhere else in the world and you might think the trains are better, they're certainly cheaper, I can get to work more easily, the food's possibly better, this is better and that's better. But the one thing that isn't better is the museums, and the one thing that isn't free is the museums, and we've got that. And yet, we don't seem to take that much pride in it at the governmental level, which strikes me as an odd thing. Is it possible to measure? I think of London as a very multicultural city with galleries from all over the world, art from all over the world, a Russian auction house. in London, it strikes me that the city is itself a kind of living piece of cultural diplomacy. That's how it works. That's why people want to be here, because there's all that. And it's almost emanates out from the British Museum. Does anyone know on the panel if anyone has done any kind of studies? The actual benefits that accrue. Because I would have thought somebody ought to be putting this under the nose of the powers that be. Yeah,
well, I've written this. But when it comes to the issue of sort of measuring the benefits of cultural diplomacy, it's very, very difficult indeed, because they're long-term. You had your British Council's questionnaire. I won't answer how many it's probably about 3 or 4 information. But it takes a while for these benefits to accrue, and how do you measure them? How do you put a figure on them? And we live in a culture where you can't count it doesn't count. So it doesn't kind of go into the mix. It stays as this sort of rather diffuse cloud that everybody accepts as a good thing. Nobody quite knows what to do. It's a strange thing. I should let somebody else comment, but if we have time later, I'd be very happy to talk about this government's approach to culture.
Others do comment. Please.
Well, I think we should mention in this context the BBC World Service and the cutbacks there are spectacularly stupid. It was very, in terms of South Park, it was a very, very cheap program. It had very, very positive jump about Britain for the rest of the world.
Yes, unfortunately, especially when we just opened a new building that cost £1,000 million. That maybe can even work in, but I'm not going to say more than that.
Well, I think when it comes to multicultural cities such as London, I think that doesn't actually qualify that much anymore as cultural exchange, but sort of beginning of something completely new. People meet and create something here, and it's something new. It's not something that has been brought from outside, nor is it sort of kind of proper British thing, or British might be not proper English, or but it just creates a very fertile environment for all sorts of things, and normally whenever you have had big innovations or big flourishing of culture, we more often than not have been exactly very multinational or heterogeneous environments. So that is good already in economic ways. I mean, you can end up in Skype or something that will actually end up being a huge economic benefit, and not just in purely artistic and cultural sphere.
Traditionally, one of the fears in totalitarian countries, one of the fears of cultural exchange was as soon as cultural exchange equals cultural contamination. You've got to keep it out, keep it at bay. And you still get that in China. You don't quite realise it until you try and go on the internet, just how much you can't look at. You can't look at this information, that information. It's, in a sense, it's a way of, I think, trying to sort of control people's behaviour. And I think that in a way, also, it's a recognition, it's like a compliment to the power of art, or the power of images, the power of ideas, the power of words, the power of music. It's a compliment because it's suggesting that everything might be contaminated or altered by their force. And it can. William. I think I'd like to hear your comments. You passed. It's nasty.
No, I think it's a really interesting observation. I think, and very, very true. With deep historical roots too. Very deep historical.
But do you think it's changing? Because I felt in China that it was changing, but it changes in a very peculiar way. It doesn't change by active promotion of cultural diplomacy. It proceeds by kind of closing of the eye, like one eye goes to sleep.
Yeah.
And it depends where you are. In Beijing, probably both eyes are awake. But if you're in Nanjing province, one eye's asleep. It's all right.
Yeah.
You can Google that.
Well, I think it's one of the most exciting things about the times that we live in, that kind of peer-to-peer contact is possible now, and it does break down those official barriers because they are unsustainable really in the world that we live in. And the more you get cultural contact between peoples, the more they understand their peers without the intermediation of government propaganda or media bias as well. So this is what I think one of the most interesting and important things about cultural diplomacy at the moment. If you think about it more as that peer-to-peer level rather than a state-to-state, government-to-government agenda, it opens up all sorts of really quite exciting possibilities. And you mentioned cities earlier, I think that's really interesting too, because what we're seeing at the moment is a lot of cities bypassing their national governments and getting together at a mayoral and administrative level. When the Olympics was on in London, there was the first ever cultural summit of world cities. I just can't remember who they all were. I think there were people like Sydney and Sao Paulo, all coming together to talk about a cultural agenda that when they saw making links at that rather than at diplomatic or foreign office to foreign office.
I have two thoughts come to mind. One about the internet in China. I was amazed when I went to China at how thorough the blocks are, but also how easy they were to get around. You set up a virtual private network, it's called, and you can get around the firewall detector in America. And it took me 5 minutes to do this when I was in China. So I have the impression, and I imagine that for the Chinese it's, I have to pay something, but I imagine that for the Chinese, they will have learned lots of ways around the firewall as well. So the effect of it is more symbolic than real. It's not actually stopping things coming in. It's just kind of a sign that they're humans. It's not a free country. Regular reminder to people of that. The other thing about the internet, I mean, on the whole, I think that is positive on these aspects. Easy to get, much easier to get a cultural exchange than it was in the past. But it can have harmful effects as well. You have this phenomenon of Twitter mobs that are really quite nasty. And again, we see that in China, where you can get hyper-nationalist feelings expressed on the internet and amplified amongst the people on the internet tend to only speak to people who believe the same thing. You can get amplification of extreme views rather than excluding out of views. So it's a complicated picture.
One question I have maybe for countries is when you're talking about cultural diplomatic, as it were, exchange between, say, Britain and Russia, would you say that one side has more to gain than the other? In the sense that, if there are already a certain number of Russian artists in London, is their work going to be less of a surprise than the British artist presence? I haven't been to Russia for a few years, so I just don't know.
No, I don't think in cultural exchanges one ever can say that one gains more, because it's just to bring yet another example from my own background in Russia and Estonia. It's funny. I mean, the relationship was always pretty complicated, and but it's interesting that both sides could have a sort of complex of either superiority or inferiority vis-a-vis each other about the same things. Often Russians, when they wanted to be superior, would say that we have Tchaikovsky, Chekhov, all these kind of big famous names. What do you have, small Estonians? You have nothing. Estonians said, yeah, but we have clean streets, we have cafes, we're proper coffee, but do you have nothing? Or alternatively, Estonians could admire the great Russian composers and Russians could admire clean Estonian streets. So I think that people who have true respect for other cultures, they never try to look at them as inferior, regardless of how big are the names, or they try to look into new and interesting, and they tend to find new and interesting. I mean, a living culture never exhausts itself. itself. It's not like we have seen it all, there is nothing more. You know, I read all of Chekhov, but I didn't need to read anything more in Russian. It just never is like that.
Yeah, I agree. I think you can think of that question in terms of winning and losing politically, and I think that's probably a win-win, the more cultural contact. The more, the better people understand each other, the better it is for everyone. But there is this underlying worry, I think, for a lot of people of cultural winners and losers. That as culture spreads, either you can get one dominant culture suppressing a small local culture, and it does happen. Or you can end up with cultural homogenization, and we have the same phenomenon culturally all over the world. I think these are the two distinct worries. Personally, I certainly don't worry about the second of those too much. I think you're right. A resilient culture is a resilient culture. All cultures throughout history have adapted, changed, morphed, and generally improved through contact with other cultures and other technologies through culture as well. But it's certainly something people worry about.
But I think that what is important is that a culture doesn't become its sort of monument to itself, because sometimes you can see with kind of stiff things. I mean, there are towns or cities in Europe that basically look like monuments to their own legendary past, and not much in terms of Russian living culture today anymore. Or I have been traveling in Siberia, and we have these small Greek peoples whose culture really is concentrated into some folk dancing group, and that is it. I mean, they gather in the House of Culture, as they call it in Russia. They rehearse and then they perform to tourists. And I don't know, I guess the real living culture might still exist somewhere in Batavia, well hidden, well kept. I mean, we small peoples have ways of hiding their soul so that no one can get to it and do undue things to it. But, you know, if it just ends up being a staged thing, a monument, a memory, then that is really sad. And sometimes when I see something that I really like, and it's a sort of new thing, I think that, wow, it'll become a legend. But I'm privileged to be here when it starts, when it's fresh, when it doesn't yet have all this kind of meta culture about it. Hordes of people who come to see the way it was, but I'm here when it is. Well, I'm seeing the thing they are coming to see later. So try to think that way as well. Sometimes it's very interesting.
So you see the art before it got famous?
Exactly.
Before fame changed it. That talk about homogenization of culture through cultural exchange reminds me of something that Andy Warhol said. He said that in Russia, under communism, they tried to make everything and everybody the same. What they didn't understand is that happens automatically in America with capitalism.
That's actually a very interesting observation. One thing that surprised me about Soviet Russia, and it survived for a while, I think it's dying out now, was how different groups were. Because in Western countries, everybody tended to, there was a strong tendency for everybody to believe the same thing, think the same thing. The television was very strong influence in homogenizing views. Whereas in the Soviet Union, nobody believed anything which was said on television and official channels. So with everybody ignoring what was said officially, they each had their own little groups of friends who believed their own little bizarre things. And there was actually much more variety of opinions than there was in the West.
But it's also actually interesting how sometimes sort of authoritarian state-managed cultures, or the part of culture that is managed by state, tends to think similarly. Well, not even authoritarian, but sort of kind of official thinking. When bureaucrats try to do culture, they end up doing it in a pretty similar way, I've noticed. I remember when I was a young journalist, I attended NATO's summit in Madrid in 1997. And at summits, what they do, they give you a bag of small gifts, you know, pens or what have you. And I got a T-shirt, and there was a picture on vacation. And it looked exactly like a picture that used to be all over the place in the Soviet Union, vision of peace, as they would call it. It was so familiar, I thought, wow, that is something I didn't expect from NATO. But it was this kind of official approach to images that gave exactly the same result in the Soviet Union and in NATO. Or just to bring another example, I happened to once, a few years ago, to visit the Ataturk Museum in Ankara, together with the current Polish foreign minister. And he just pointed out something and said, Kadri, does that not look familiar? And yet again, exactly that kind of Soviet dogmas about culture. And you could see that reproduced without having been consciously inspired by the Soviet Union. But just some sort of thinking goes in a similar way.
Do we know any of the cultural activities that are going to take place in the UK and Russian exchange yet?
Yeah, can I take the question? Well, for me as a Korean, it's very privileged to know that UK will be presenting a young British artist in Moscow. So I just wanted to come back to this point of cross-cultural dialogue. Of course, we all know that Russia has the merits in all different types of kinds of art, such as music, architecture, art and literature, but it's really doesn't have as much practices as UK have in contemporary art. So I think this exhibitions as a part of program contemporary exhibitions will really help to create this kind of dialogue between British and Russian artists, which is very important now because there isn't much practices happening in Russia. Well, that's a really important exhibition, which I think is a kind of is a series of exhibitions that will be creating state Russian museums. We just had an exhibition in Moscow in June, opening at the Pushkin Museum, at the State Pushkin Museum of Fine Arts, which was peripheral light exhibitions from the collection of Tate Modern. And as a part of the Russian program, UK-Russian program next year, we will be having an exhibition of State Kritikov's collection of Russian avant-garde here at the Tate Modern this time. So I think the program is really rich in terms of culture and arts and education as well.
And will there be, as well as the presumably constructivist masterpieces and things of that nature from the State Church,
yeah.
Will there be much in the way of contemporary art exchange?
There will be contemporary art exchange in a certain way of British artists, in Moscow, but not the other way around.
Not the other way around.
Yeah, there will be like 2 events, I think, but that will be like with scholars and foundation, but not by state collections.
Do you think there might be a fringe?
I'm not sure. Can't really speak for the program. I think Theodora was supposed to come and speak about it. I just
no, just
some information about it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if, does anyone on the panel have any more to say? Because I was going to throw it open to the public at some point around that. Should we do that? Not the public, those of you who are here, the press. If there are any questions, fire away or raise your hand and we'll be given a mic.
James Roberts from the Tablet, which is a Catholic paper. Perceptions of Russian culture and Russian artists from here seem to be rather narrow and blinkered in my view. And it goes back to politics. Unless an artist is somehow very critical of Putin and the government, they don't seem to have credibility in the eyes of this narrow culture here. I think that, personally, I think that needs to be nuanced because of Putin in Russia, my impression is that he's more popular, to say, than Obama in the US at the moment, or Cameron here, or Hollande in France, I think. You can correct me on that. But what I would want to get at is, he seems to be doing something about rescuing Russian self-respect, and I wonder what the artists, how artists view that. And is it possible to be a serious, critical, independent-minded artist and to not disapprove of Putin? That's my question.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I mean, they mock him pretty mercilessly, actually, and they started a long time ago. I sometimes go to theatre when I go to Moscow, when I can get tickets, and it's amazing how, I mean, I live in a different environment, and sometimes when I watch a play in Moscow, I don't automatically interpret it politically, but Russian audience does. I mean, they create these political clauses. And it doesn't apply to just dissident theatres. I mean, there's Kalyakin theatre that actually has got lots of money from the state, and is sort of close to powers. I mean, many liberal politicians then go there as a sign of protest. But I went there. Adolf Shapiro had staged a play there, Fahrenheit 4/5, how many degrees it was. And you know, he hadn't done it consciously political. And I, with my sort of Estonian eyes, would have watched it as sort of anti-mass communication or anti-mass culture thing. The Russians made it political just by applauding, picking up the kind of pieces that had some sort of political pretext or to which they could add political pretext, because it wasn't there originally, and they made it political. So, I don't know, I mean, artists and writers, that crowd is sort of free-thinking and pluralist by nature. And I think Putin generally has nothing against free-thinking and pluralist society, but he just thinks that the society needs to think the way he does, because he's a good guy, he's doing the right thing, and how come they don't agree with me? The ones who don't, they must be brought up. I mean, he doesn't really accept differences very well, or he doesn't accept that differences can come from friends. I mean, there are certain spheres where he has accepted it. Say, economics, for example, has been one of these. He really has had many liberal economists next to him and advising him and disagreeing with him. But that is sort of a pretty rational sphere, and you can have that sort of conversation there. But someone who agrees, I actually just finished a very interesting book, which you might actually read, and it actually harmonizes with this exhibition here even. A book by Father Dixon, a monk who is said to be Putin's spiritual father. And the book is about church life mostly in the Soviet Union. Basically, his memories, how he became a monk after having graduated from Institute of Cinematography, and how he served in different monasteries and what sort of types he met there. All these old monks and nuns who had been through the war, or through repressions, or often both. It's quite extraordinary, and I think he doesn't really disapprove of Putin, because Putin is a pretty orthodox person, and I think they find common language on a certain level. And the book was very interesting in the sense that I tried to see whether it is sort of conservative Putinist orthodox propaganda. And it's true that they keep silent about certain episodes in the Orthodox Church, but even so is page it really gets hold of you. So Everyday Sense is the English title. So read it. You will learn a lot. It's interesting.
It's an interesting question, because I certainly agree that the image in the West is distorted by political bias. There was an awful woman in Kiev who took off her top and cut down the cross. And I think she should be in jail. The French reaction was to give her a visa. And there is this, the easiest way to get a Western visa now is to pretend to be a political artist. And that must have a distorting effect. But on the other hand, there really is political art in Russia. People are at times looking things are politicalized. So it's not a complete distortion, but it's certainly distorting things.
Thank you. My name is James Nixie. I work for a research institute like Kadri, actually. In fact, we have the same job, actually, in different organizations. The problem with diplomacy is that it masks dishonesty. So just to be honest for a second, I think it needs to be said that Russia is a corrupt and authoritarian state. So thank God for events like this and the UK-Russia year of culture, because quite honestly right now, it's all we've got. The political relations between the UK and Russia are very bad. The investment climate is extremely poor. We're just not getting on right now. So again, thank God for great, fantastic, wonderfully rich Russian culture and British culture. So I'm going to try and answer the question, but I'm failing really. But I would just say maybe to Annya, in fact, who started out, the quote which she said at the beginning was by Tuchev about Russia. You can only understand Russia with your heart, you can't understand your mind. The unfortunate thing with that, and Kadri referred to this when she said it's our job to think about it with our minds. If we thought about Russia with our hearts, actually we shouldn't be doing our jobs, actually. So, and Tuchev's phrase, that Annya finished with, has been used by all manner of very nasty Russian nationalists to justify all manner of Russian excesses. So I think that we need to embrace Russian culture and really support events like this and this next year. But we need to have our eyes open at the same time. Otherwise it's a bit naive and it's possibly dangerous. Sorry, that wasn't a question after all, I hope you don't mind.
My name is Catherine Milner, I'm a journalist. It's a question for John, really. Has art ever been used as a way of deflecting war in any capacity? I mean, what inroads have been made into the Syrians? I know it's sort of Russia for the moment, but in general terms, what has art had any useful function in cataclysmic situations like Syria?
Yes and no. I mean, I think we mustn't think that culture can solve all the problems of the world. And as you were saying, you can't use the kind of paper over the cracks. Culture can be very powerful. Think of Picasso's Guernica in the United Nations, having to be covered up and covered in power against speech. These are powerful, symbolic things which go to the heart of very serious matters. I think you can think about the Divan Orchestra, made up of Palestinian and Israeli musicians, building a bridge between two battling communities. So I think culture can. Oh, sorry. Did you hear any of that? Yes. So I think culture can play a very crucial role in extreme situations, but it's not a sort of magic answer to all problems.
Yeah, I think culture can be devastated by war, and culture can start war. I mean, wasn't George endorsement as kind of gift, cultural gift, and what happened? But yeah, no, I'm afraid. Well, you can argue. You can bring an example from my own background. Estonia had what was called singing revolution. So maybe otherwise there would have been a different and more bloody kind. But so yeah, occasionally, but you cannot use it as a miracle cure in any conscious manner.
Yeah, the notion that art is a good thing is naive. Art is not necessarily a good thing at all. Henry Fuseli, who used to be the professor of painting at the Royal Academy, said the artists can be the worst of people because they can come up with something really horrible and they can persuade you to believe it because they're so good at art. And I made a TV program, a documentary about Hitler about 3 or 4 years ago, in which I argued that Hitler was evil and dangerous precisely because he was an artist. He was an artist. He considered what he was doing as art. He was absolutely brilliant at it. He used the power of imagery, the power of sound, the power of light, and the power of music, and the power of displays of mass bodies, the same tricks of painters, filmmakers, ballet dancers, choreographers, speakers to engineer truly terrible things. So you can't say the culture is in itself. It's all about what's behind it.
Yeah, and I agree with you actually that it can be dangerous. I know many also contemporary people who are just so taken in by the aesthetic phase of things, but they forget about ethics. And you know, something being really aesthetic makes it worth for them, and they don't think of other things. And these are actually really scary people.
Hi, I'm Chris Notts. I'm founder of the culturetrip.com, which is a website for art and culture for literally every country in the world. Now, we've been doing this for just under 2 years, and preparing for this panel, I didn't prepare, but I was looking at the data, the visitors we get through such a website in the last year. And it was really quite interesting if we look at people that come to the website, where they come from and what they look at. So Americans look at America and France. But then it becomes very interesting. Regions where there is conflict, they look into each other's country section. So we saw visitors from Israel looking into the Palestinian territory section, in the Iran section, and vice versa. We see a lot of people from China looking into Japan or Taiwan section. Very interesting, and vice versa. Another interesting phenomenon is trying this riot here to see if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, was on social media, where we weren't particularly active. So we write about all things art and culture. And in the summer, we started getting active on Facebook. So we published, or we posted about 10 articles a day on art and culture from a variety of countries across the world. And within a week, we saw that we gained 40,000 followers from Pakistan only. Even more interesting, 1 in 4 decided to like and share posts about Israeli culture, which is something that you wouldn't quite expect. And we saw this phenomenon throughout. A week later, there were 30,000 people from Egypt signing up. Again, a country you wouldn't quite expect in this current climate to be overly interested in global culture. That's exactly what we saw. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on this in view of cultural diplomacy.
Yeah, first of all, can I use you as a case study? It sounds fascinating data, it really does. Yeah, one of the things that's always struck me that if you go to the British Museum and see what tourists from different countries go and see, they first of all go and see the Egyptian stuff, but then they very often go and see stuff from their own countries, so like Chinese people, the Chinese section, Middle Eastern people, Middle Eastern parts, and so forth. So one interesting aspect of cultural diplomacy, which is often overlooked, I think, is how we here in London reflect back the world to itself. So that the way in which we do that becomes important in that ranking of engaging people and influencing them. Because if we make mistakes about things, if we consign them to a dusty corner of the museum, we are putting a message out about what we think are there in the cultures. So it's quite a subtle and interesting thing, I think, what people look at, and hence how you have to think through the implications of that.
Hi, I'm Susanna Sekas. I'm a freelance journalist here in London. I spent a bunch of time in Russia, and just recently, I think it's this week, the New York Times had an article about there being something like 300,000 Russians living in London, and they do this synopsis of this new series called Meet the Russians, sort of like a reality show. So my question is, they're going to profile, the rich and famous Russian rich in London. My question is this the new sort of trend of the opulent lives of the Russians as cultural diplomacy?
Well, I was on that program. But unfortunately, my program wasn't that bad. It was mainly my wife's program, and her program was quite positive. But it was an astonishing program because you can help meet the Russians and the stars of Ukrainian woman with the Pakistani husband. And emphasizing the most crass kind of wealthy Russian, which does exist, but is by no means typical. And they did that in order to reflect British prejudice and get a bigger audience. And they got a bigger audience, but it wasn't a very good picture of Russia unless you watched it extremely critically and concentrated on some of the more positive portrayal, or more serious people that were around it. On the 300,000, I think that 300,000 includes all Russian speakers. So it would include colleagues on my left and right who I believe are not ethnic Russians. But it would include Russian-speaking Estonians and Russian-speaking Ukrainians and so forth. So it's using an extremely broad definition. But there are none us a lot of Russians, and many of them are quite poor, and many of them are quite serious in the portrayal of the main capital of the Russians is extremely misleading.
But it's not part of the UK-Russian cultural exchange. Still have to point that out.
Maybe jump on their bandwagon or something, I don't know, on the publicity.
Well, it does go to show how broadly you have to think about international cultural relations. You know, TV programs are just as important as exhibitions and more formal aspects of culture.
My name is Josephine Burton. I'm not a journalist. I run an arts organisation, Dash Arts, and I'm working a lot at the moment with artists from Russia and the region, so I'm very interested in listening to the conversation. And I wondered, John, you talked about this peer-to-peer relationships as well as the country-to-country relationships, and I was struck actually by what you were saying about going around Siberia and experiencing this sort of this memorial to the Greek culture rather than anything living out. From my perspective, there is living stuff. There's extraordinary folk musicians and so on, and my sense is there may be two different worlds. There may well be the official channels, and then there's this peer-to-peer work that happens. And I have a kind of endless question about the role of the artist in this conversation, because we haven't really talked about what it is to be an artist and to be appropriated by a country to represent a country. And perhaps there is another community of artists that don't want to be part of official channels. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that and what that does, what it means, what the role of an artist in this official year next year should or could be.
Okay. I think that the peer-to-peer thing has obviously exploded over the years. It's not just the internet that's done it. It's cheap flights, mass tourism, large diaspora communities linking up with each other, south to south as well as north to south. That's a fact and a phenomenon, and that's what makes international cultural relations so interesting. Now, as for the role of the artist, I think you're right. I mean, it's very dangerous, I think, as we said, for governments to try to co-opt institutions or artists because it destroys the credibility. Artists should be free to do what they want, where they want, as far as I'm concerned. But nonetheless, in going out there and visiting other places and putting their work out there, it does have communal and political effects. So even though they are independent actors, they are still having a real world effect in this kind of sphere.
No, of course I agree, but I think it's that when it comes to very small family Greek nations or maybe small nations in general, that's a specific thing. They have sort of their own strategies of really hiding away what is sacred for them. I mean, with a friend of mine who used to go to hunt it a lot, I mean, he said that, their strategy of self-protection is basically to mirror you back, to give you what they expect you want to hear. He had been asking, our hunt is from one certain town, do you form a legal body or not? And the answer in the end was, yes, we have a legal body, but unofficially. because they weren't quite clear what the interviewer wanted to hear. So they just give you an image of yourself. But also another story that I remember, and it's sort of fitting in the context of Russia and the UK and role of artists, is actually And part of it is the story why I myself ended up going to Russia. That was a bad book by a British writer, and it was bad. James Aldrich, Diplomat, fake one. It was translated in the Soviet Union because it had some communist sympathies in it, and they thought it would be beneficial to sort of expose the flaws of capitalism, etc. And so I ended up reading it, and I sort of remembered it. I remembered how it depicted Moscow, and there was something exciting about Moscow. And I realized that the writer didn't really manage to decode it, but he didn't understand the thing himself either. It kind of remained mystical and exotic to him. And later, at one point I thought, reading another cinema book, that was using kind of sounds and smells of Soviet Empire just to make it more exotic for Western audience. I kind of got slightly angry, why do you come here and take risks, take risks over history just to decorate your book, because for us it's lives and lives lost and what have you. But then I suddenly realized that maybe it's not so bad, because the literature that actually grasps the real nature of some awful things, it's sometimes impossible to read. I mean, I have never finished Bulgakov's letter to Stalin. It's like 3 or 4 pages, but it's too horrible. I've never got through it. So in that sense, this bad book by Aldrich sort of inspired me to get interested in Russia, because I saw there is something that he has noticed it, not quite understood. Maybe I should film myself and investigate. And the funny thing is that many of my friends actually remember the same book from childhood, and we discussed it when we were posted in Moscow, them as diplomats, me as journalist. So, it wasn't good art, but it actually played a role.
Thank you. I'm Pamela Kember, Head of Arts and Learning here at Asia House. Thank you all very much. I think this is a really important debate to have, particularly as we're talking about internationalism or transnationalism, as I like to think of it. What I like to think of is encounters between cultures that have to cross borders, because so many of us work outside of our place of origin, of our languages and cultures, but at the same time we're bringing new things to the table. And I hope it isn't a one-way dialogue, that we can think about what cultures, for example, my own background in China and Hong Kong. I worked with a group of Chinese avant-garde artists during the 90s, when they all had to leave self-exile from China to work in the West. Now, whether we can talk about propaganda in terms of what they were doing, not speaking on behalf of the state, but anti-state, was very different to what exposure they had when they came to the West. And that's what I really hope with this dialogue, is that we are exposed more to artists who have a voice and can share their world with us. Thank you.
Not really a question, so yeah.
My name is Abia Mishkas. I'm a journalist here in London in a Middle Eastern newspaper. I just have one question. Is the political strains or strained relations, can they be really, can they stop Russia's influence, cultural influence? I mean, thinking of Iran, for example, you can see Iranian artists specifically that are just enjoying a boom in all the auction houses, or the Iranian films, for example, although the relations are not great with the West, but people are more interested. Would that be something happen to the other side as well, to Russia?
Yeah, I think culture can help in terms of strained relations, both at a formal level, like we were talking about the museum exhibition about Iran. They can sort of form a bridge when formal diplomatic relations are strained. They can act as a way to bypass media perceptions of different places. As you mentioned, the Iranian film is a prime example of that. But they can't kind of work miracles, and they don't always work. The New York film, Phil Mike did a tour of North Korea, which was much lauded in the newspapers to be an example of great cultural diplomacy. It didn't really lead to anything in the end. So, it helps, but it doesn't really work, and sometimes it's counterproductive.
Yeah, well, art can can be very subversive. I mean, Soviet Union is a perfect example of an empire collapsed by art. Soviet Union tried to close its borders to Western art, and the result was everyone got interested in it and started sharing it. But I wonder if we are going to see any examples like that these days, because for that way the world has become so interconnected that messages and art, and it just flows around, and some of it even becomes devalued in the process. So it's mixed blessing. I sometimes would say that in the Soviet Union, really, people paid much bigger attention to books, and there was a whole generation in Russia, and sadly, they are about to die soon, and they are not being replaced by anything similar. I mean, people who could just quote lines, kilometers of poetry, and it's not fair anymore, because poetry doesn't play the same role, art still play the same role. They aren't so exclusive, they aren't, where the real thing is hidden and concentrated. Life is much more heterogeneous, expresses itself in other spheres. So sometimes I miss it. It's an environment where you can discuss in quotes from poems and everyone understands what it is about.
Well, with that touch, chiaroscuro, we will finish the panel discussion. I'll ask Annya to come up. You're going to introduce Theodora.
Before I introduce Theodora, I would like to thank everyone here today for your contribution into our discussion on such a fascinating subject. And I would like to say a special thank you to Andrew for being a wonderful chair, and to all the panelists, to Gayane, Kadri, William and John. Thank you very much. And now I would like to introduce to you Theodora Clarke, who is the guest editor of the UK-Russia Year of Culture Guide.
Hello everybody, apologies for being a bit late. I've been doing my bit to spread Russia across the UK, so I've been lecturing in Nottingham on Malievich. But on some more important things in the Year of Russian Culture. And as Annya has introduced me, I actually was very cheeky. There was no official publication for the Year of Russian Culture, so I decided to create one and persuaded the ambassador and the director of the British Council to write an official welcome. So I believe you all have a copy in each of your goodie bags, and I've spent 3 months basically interviewing all of the people who are organising major events for 2014. And I really want to talk just very briefly about why I think the Russian Year of Culture next year is so important. And I know you've had quite a cerebral political discussion about the importance of cultural diplomacy. But I wanted to talk very specifically about Russia and the importance of next year. And also why I do think that having these bilateral years is actually very important and is a great springboard for other projects. And a lot of people say to me, well, what's the point of this project next year? Isn't this just a lot of patting on the back, 2 foreign secretaries posing for a photograph? And of course, yes, there is a huge amount of political background and context to 2014. But actually what I've seen when I've interviewed the curators, the musicians, the ballet dancers, the people who are involved in next year's projects, actually it's a great example of a way to build relationships and bridges between peers, between individuals and institutions. And I think those of you who work with Russian organisations, as most of the panel does, will know that dealing with Russians is a very bureaucratic process. They love their paperwork and their stamps, and to get anything done takes a huge amount of effort. And one of the things that's really struck me, particularly for example, when I interviewed the curators of the major Russian space exhibition, which is part of the official programme for next year, which is at the Science Museum, is they said, without the cultural year, they couldn't have actually done a project like this, for two reasons. First of all, the objects which are being loaned have never ever been shown to the public before, and there's no way that the Russian government would have let them leave Russia if it wasn't for the fact it was for this very high-profile project. But let's just go back a few years, and what I really think is interesting is how the political relationship and cultural diplomacy has changed so much in the last few years. And I was just racking my brains of when the British Council offices closed down, and I looked up, it was December 2007, and that is not a long time ago that we actually had British diplomats being expelled from Russia, that we had the British Council, which is purely a cultural organisation, having a number of its offices closed across Russia. And we only have those three offices now left in Moscow, St. Petersburg and Ekaterinburg. And that's an interesting to look, I think, about the politics and the culture, because I would definitely not say that there has been a reset of relations necessarily between Russia and the UK. Let's not exaggerate how good the relationship is. And I think that was highlighted in September with the comments about Britain being a very small island, I seem to recall, in St. Petersburg. But what I do think is that the government and culture can play an important role. And let me give you an example. Those of you who went to the Royal Academy exhibition in 2008 called From Russia, of French and Russian paintings from state museums, you probably remember it was widely reported that the exhibition nearly didn't happen, and that was purely because of politics. So these are paintings being lent from state museums to a British major national institution, the Royal Academy. And the exhibition nearly didn't happen because there were concerns about potential claims being made on those paintings, and so we actually had to have special emergency legislation passed through the House of Commons in order for the Russian Cultural Service to actually release those pictures and to give them an export license. So I think that's a good example of where the government has actually been very useful in terms of helping to build relationships and links between museums. And in fact, I've seen myself how the links are starting to grow already for next year. In fact, I've just got back from St. Petersburg, where I was invited to speak at the conference that the Hermitage had on digital media and the arts. And I was the only UK journalist invited there, but they said to me, we wouldn't have invited you if it wasn't for 2014. So that's how they found out about my project, Russian Art and Culture, and the fact that I run this big website on Russian cultural events in Europe. And I think culture is very important for a central reason, which is about understanding. And we've talked a lot today about stereotypes, and someone mentioned about the terrible Fox programme, Meet the Russians. And that's why I think culture is very important, because it is a way to engage, to increase understanding, to understand more about Russia's heritage. And I've been teaching today about the Russian avant-garde and modernism. And actually Russia has an extraordinary cultural heritage. I think if you stop most people in the street, they would have heard of Tchaikovsky or Kandinsky or Tolstoy. These are major figures, not just in Russian history, but in world history, who have made a significant, valuable contribution. And when I was talking to the British Council and the Russian Embassy about next year, the focus of the year is really twofold. A, it's of course a fantastic PR exercise for the UK, in that we can showcase all of the wonderful projects like the Royal Shakespeare Company, the National Theatre, Young British Artists. Peter Greenaway, I know, is going to curate a major exhibition of Russian modernism in Manege. So there's lots of big projects being organised by the British Council to represent really the best of British institutions. But also it's an opportunity, I think, for British people to learn more about Russia, whether that is the Maslenitsa Festival in Trafalgar Square, the Russian Film Festival, the other projects I'm involved in with William of Russian Art Week, or the numerous events that are happening. And in fact, I brought with me the official list that I've finally been given of the events for next year. And this sort of sums up for me as well the year. In fact, this is the official logo that I was given in my pack from the British logo. And this was a joint tender put together by the British Council and the Russian embassy. And the fact that it was a joint project really sums up next year, that it is one about collaboration. And what I've found when I've spoken to curators is how much access they've been given to Russian archives, Russian museums, curators, access to their peers in state institutions. And I just want to give the example of the major show at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which opens in the summer, of Russian avant-garde theatre design. And in fact, let me just quote you. This is what the curator in Russia said to me about the importance of next year. He said, "This exhibition is extremely important in terms of demolishing the image in the West of Russia as an enemy. Any cultural action will build the bridges between countries, so culture can be important politically. This exhibition is important as it introduces a slice of Russian culture from our past to new audiences. It's also incredibly important for Russia as a country, particularly for our government, to showcase how important Russian culture is." And that was one of the Russian curators. And what was interesting was talking to him about this shared collaborative process. It's actually very unusual to have a Russian state curator working with a British counterpart. We've had a few instances of that, such as the V&A Treasures of the Royal Court exhibition. I know they've been building strong links with the Kremlin. We've also had the Henry Moore exhibition travel there. Next year there are various plans for big Russian and English portraiture exhibitions. But what he was saying was that without this project next year, to even get a project like that off the ground, where you have the Bakrushkin Museum, which specialises in the ballet russe and theatre material, to get them to lend works outside of Russia is incredibly difficult and incredibly bureaucratic. So the fact that you have this partner, or in this instance the V&A and a major leading British curator, Kate Bailey, is the reason that these projects are able to work together. So really I just wanted to give you a quick overview of some of the events in case you're wondering what's happening next year. And the first thing to say is there will be an official website. It's going to be www.ukrussia2014.ru, and that won't go live till January. And to answer the basic questions first, yes, the Year of Culture is a whole year. The official year starts in January and runs right the way through to December. And the opening event is scheduled to be Peter Greenaway's show in April in Moscow, and then a closing event in December at the Science Museum where the Russian space show is. But just to give you an idea of the programmes, I know the British Council was very keen to promote the whole range of British creative talent, whether that's film, design, music, literature, absolutely everything. So not just focused on the big institutions, but also the smaller ones as well. And just to give you a couple of highlights happening in Russia next year. We have, of course, celebrating James Bond, designing 007 50 Years of Bond Style, which will be at the Moscow Multimedia Art Museum. And then next September, there'll be a major exhibition at the Ekaterina Foundation, looking at the young British artist movement in Russia, particularly looking at Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin, Sam Taylor-Wood, some of the major figures from the UK. And then we have various theatre seasons. So I know, for example, Sad as Well, Young Vic, RSC, Scottish Ballet, all of these big national touring organisations will be going to Russia. And I know 12th Night and The Tempest will be going to Russian cities. And then there are various other events with fashion, with opera, and things like the Rostropovich Festival and screenings of various films. So that's the programme in Russia. And just to finish with, sort of to whet your appetite really for the events happening next year, there's going to be a number of major state museums, and that includes the Science Museum looking at Russian space exploration. And actually, if you read my interview with the curator, they have some amazing stuff coming. They even have the original spacesuits worn by Belka and Strelka, first dogs to go to space and come back again. So amazing objects which have really never been displayed before. And then we've obviously got the major retrospective of Kazimir Malevich and the Russian avant-garde opening at Tate Modern. And then we've got a number of different festivals happening, such as Massachusetts and the Russian Film Festival. So really that just gives you kind of a very quick overview. But all I really want to say is that I do think next year is a great opportunity, and of course it wouldn't be possible without government support and the role of these major state institutions. But ultimately what it really boils down to is people and the individual projects that they care passionately about, which they wanted to organise. And I can tell you from organising my own projects that taking on a Russian cultural project is not something you undertake lightly. It is a lot of work and a lot of bureaucracy, but just the range of projects organised shows you that I think next year will be a great showcase of Russian culture. So do have a look at the magazine, and of course Russian Art and Culture will be covering all the events. And if you hear of events that I don't know about, like, do let us know, because we want to have a great online resource where as many events can be listed. Because this is about you guys in the British public and making sure you have access to as much information about next year as possible. Many thanks.
First box in space. Finally, John Whittingdale, the chairman of the House of Commons Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, has very kindly agreed to say some closing words.
Thank you for your invitation to come and speak to you this afternoon. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be here for a lot of the discussion, but listening to Theodora talking about what we have in store in the year to come is very exciting. I'm delighted to be able to come along and just say a few words to you today. I do so wearing two hats. As you've just heard, I chair the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee in the House of Commons. We cover a vast range of different issues and topics. We seem to have spent a great deal of time talking about the media in recent times, but we also cover arts, heritage, museums, film, music, TV. As you can see, it's a very tough job. But I'm not just chairman of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. I'm also vice chairman of the House of Commons All-Party Russia Group. And that group is there to try and forge stronger relations and better links between the UK Parliament and the State Duma. And I was 3 weeks ago in Moscow at the second International Parliamentary Forum. I'd say it wasn't a great cultural event, but it was nevertheless a very useful opportunity to go and talk to some of my opposite numbers in the Russian Parliament. And I hope that we will be building on that. But what I am very conscious of, particularly wearing my Culture Select Committee hat, is the importance and indeed the effectiveness of cultural diplomacy and what is termed soft power. There was a time when Britain was prone to using hard power to extend its influence around the world. Some of my colleagues occasionally rather regret that we don't still do so. The temptation to send a gunboat, particularly to Gibraltar at the moment, is strong. But there is no question that Britain's strength in the area of culture and soft power is considerable. Perhaps the greatest asset that we have is the English language, which is spoken around the world. You can go to almost any city and it makes us lazy because we expect people to be able to speak English, and most of the time they do. But on top of that, we have an extraordinary rich cultural heritage in this country, and we also have the most amazingly vibrant creative sector today, which makes London one of the most exciting places to be. Perhaps the most successful demonstration of soft power in recent times was last year. It was, of course, the London 2012 Olympic Games, which projected the image of Britain around the world, and my committee spent a great deal of time worrying about all the things that might get wrong. In actual fact, very little went wrong, and it was a tremendous success. And I think it's a very good demonstration of how a sporting event like that can bring people together and can be celebrated around the world. And that's why I know that the Russian government are looking forward with equal anticipation and attaching equal importance to the Winter Olympics in Sochi in just a few months' time. The other areas where I think Britain has been very successful. We've already heard a little bit about the work of the British Council, and I make a point of going wherever I visit to go and talk to the British Council. And they do a tremendous amount, not just to promote the speaking of English around the world, but also to strengthen cultural ties, to arrange exchanges of exhibitions, artists' performances. And there is no doubt that for the relatively small cost of the British taxpayer, the influence is considerable. And the other demonstration, and the same argument applies, is of course the BBC World Service. And it is extraordinary the respect with which the World Service is still held. There are a number of competing services, but none touches the BBC World Service in terms of its reputation for objectivity and integrity. And in both the British Council and the BBC World Service, my own personal view, and I'm allowed to say this because I'm not a member of the government, I'm a backbench member, is that we have actually suffered from relatively small cuts in expenditure on those two services, but which have damaged quite badly their ability to reach out. So certainly I continue to argue that those are priorities. But they are particularly important in terms of relations with Russia. There are political differences between our two countries. Most recently, the imprisonment of the Greenpeace protesters is something which was raised at the highest level. I talked to the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee when I was in Moscow a few weeks ago. But also, obviously, issues like Magnitsky and Litvinenko, Pussy Riot, and we will have differences, and we will express those when we meet. But actually, the opportunity to meet through cultural dialogue strengthens relationships and makes it much easier to do so. And that, I think, was particularly noteworthy when most recently we were having quite robust discussions with the Russian government about what approach we should take to Syria and whether or not we should provide military support to the opposition forces there. And I can tell you that the relationship between the British Prime Minister, David Cameron, and President Putin is good and close, and is largely built on the fact that David Cameron took President Putin to watch judo at the last London Olympic Games. And it is that kind of event which actually does allow you to build a personal relationship and makes it much easier to have a discussion when there are issues of difference between us. But it is not just a shared love of judo which has brought us together. Russia, perhaps, is the one country which can boast as greater cultural heritage as the UK. As a schoolboy, I can remember, obviously, reading Dickens and Jane Austen and Trollope, but also I can remember reading Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Turgenev and Solzhenitsyn. Equally, when we go to listen to great composers, at the top of the list will always be Tchaikovsky and Prokofiev and Borodin and Shostakovich. And the sheer excitement of the opportunity to go and see in London performances by Bolshoi, or indeed, as I went to see Spartacus performed by the Mariinsky Ballet just, I think, about 2 or 3 years ago. Some of the most beautiful people I've ever set eyes upon. It's just the most magical experience. And there has also been a great deal of work done in the UK by organisations like Pushkin House, that has been very active in promoting Russian culture and art in this country. Culvert 22, that has a gallery in East London where I went to see a new exhibition of Russian art, and of course the exhibition that you're going to go on to see at Asia House downstairs in just a few minutes' time. And those are all very important, but it is particularly exciting that we are now about to enter the UK-Russia Year of Culture 2014. Theodora has talked about some of the events which will comprise that, and I do think that it will provide a great opportunity to strengthen the existing links, which are already strong, but to increase exposure of Russian culture to people in Britain, and also the exposure of British culture to people in Russia. Theodora mentioned the Maslenitsa Festival. We are going to be holding an event in Parliament to coincide with that. It's the second one that has been held there, where I hope we will have an opportunity to introduce some of my fellow parliamentarians to some Russian culture, and also maybe a bit of Russian vodka and Russian food as well. But all these things do help to bring down barriers and increase understanding between us. And I think particularly where relations have occasionally been a little strained, it makes it all the more important that we build on that. And I would lastly just say to you that I wasn't here, but I heard Theodora mention some concern was expressed about Meet the Russians on television. It is a programme, I have to say, that I have seen, and which certainly does not seem to portray either a positive or indeed an accurate picture of Russians in London. All I can tell you is that I am a Member of Parliament representing a constituency in a county called Essex. And there is another programme which is colloquially known as TOWIE, which stands for The Only Way is Essex. And all I will say is I sympathise hugely, but the people I represent feel equally strongly that that is not a positive portrayal of the county in which I am proud to live as well. So thank you for your invitation. I hope that the exhibition downstairs will be a great success. I have every confidence that the Year of Culture which lies ahead will be a great success. And it just remains for me to say that now is what you really would like to do, which is the opportunity to go downstairs and have a look at some of Annya Sand's work.